Welcome, Hannah.
Hi, thanks for having me, Deb.
Thanks for sitting here and having this conversation with us. Before there's so many things to talk about. There are so many things happening within the disability sector. So many new initiatives and we have concluded in the last so many years a Royal Commission and the NDIS review. There's so many things to talk about. But before we go in that angle, could you, briefly give us your background, what you do, and your linkage, and then work within the disability sector?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a teacher of students with disabilities since I finished uni, so that's about 14 years ago, and really, really love teaching kids. So that's a whole bunch of different types of disabilities. We've got autism, acquired brain injuries, intellectual delay, Down syndrome, and then 7 years ago, I was diagnosed with a neurological condition that was causing me to lose my hearing. And in 2020, I had brain surgery on my right side and left me profoundly deaf on that side. And then 11 months later, they had to do the left side. So I went from surround sound to no sound within 13 months. And that through the surgeries and through the condition that I have, which is called neurofibromatosis type 2, NF2, through the two of those combined, I now am DeafBlind. And so since, I'd say probably the last 18 months, I've really started to throw myself into advocacy for especially the deafblind community. And so currently I'm working as the chairperson of Deafblind West Australians, and I'm an NDIS participant, but I'm also getting my head around how that is going to, the review and the Royal Commission, how that's going to impact my community. Yeah.
Before other specific questions, could you broadly talk about the deafblind community? What are the challenges from an understanding of the audience so that they can get, the differences between people assume that all disabilities come in same box, but it's different, and every disability segment has a different challenges and different. So could you talk a bit more about, what a bit more elaborate on the deaf and blind community?
Yeah, that's fine. So the deaf-blind community, deaf-blindness often gets thought of as Helen Keller, who's probably the most famous deaf-blind person, advocate that there is. And she was profoundly deaf and blind. So no sound, no sight. So people often think that that is deaf-blindness. Deaf-blindness means you have a loss of sense in visually and auditory, and they can't be corrected with glasses, say. So lots of the people in our community are congenitally deafblind. That means they were born with it, and they gradually lose their sight, and they might be born profoundly deaf as well. So it means it's more than just not being able to hear or have vision difficulties. You've got balance deficits, so your balance nerves are affected. They need mobility and orientation assistance. There's also, a lot of the time, intellectual disabilities come along with that. English often isn't the first language. It could be Auslan or tactile sign. So language is a barrier too, even just written English. So when you're looking at things such as the NDIS, anything to do with it, which a lot of deafblind people have access to, it's not accessible to them because of the level it's written in.
As you would have gone through the Royal Commission recommendations and what has come out in the public forum, and one of the recommendations was around the special ed and the mainstream schools, and the commissioners were divided on that front, and then some of them suggested that there should be only one form of schooling. You have aggregated special ed and mainstream into one, and the few of the commissioners were of a point of view that there should be special eds and then mainstream with extra added supports. So how do you see that rolling out across different states and territories in the coming years?
That's the point, I think, that really jumped out at me when I was reading the Royal Commission. It's a really nice, big sky idea, but I'm a little concerned as to how it's actually going to come about and the everyday school life for the kids who have disabilities. because I see it from the perspective of someone with a disability, but also someone who is a teacher. So I think we can often, if you're not involved in either of those two communities, it seems like a no-brainer. Of course, we want everyone to have the same access. We don't want a segregated education system. But when you're actually down there on the front line, it's not as black and white. We have students, I've taught students who I know they're borderline funding, and often the school takes them on, and the education support centres will take them on because they know that they're going to get lost within a mainstream school setting. They'll either fall through the cracks or they'll start to truant and they won't turn up to school. So I see these kids and I see them coming to school, engaging, learning to read at the age of 15, that type of thing. If it wasn't for that system, those kids would be either, not at school, maybe in the justice system because of that. And I think from a teacher's perspective, you've got such a wide range of abilities. There's only one teacher in a classroom, so all these initiatives are great, but I don't know how the teachers are going to be supported through it. We already have a teaching shortage. So it just seems to me a really nice big idea, but I haven't seen enough substance behind it as to how that's going to play out. I'd fully support it if they've structured it and they've timelined it, but I think it's in a way throwing a really big bomb into an education system that's already struggling.
Can I ask you to just give us a bit more broader picture on the education system for the teachers? So when we train teachers, so through that education system in the universities and the vet courses, are the teachers being trained to engage with kids with disabilities and of the whole variety of, and yes, as you pointed out, the teaching shortage or teachers shortage, which is a bigger issue, but the teachers who we have available, how they are well trained to engage with people with disabilities?
That's a very good question. I found through my university experience very limited teaching on students with disabilities. I did every possible core unit that I could do, and then the specialist units on top of that, because I knew that that's the direction I wanted to teach in. And it was very shallow. What we learnt, it was a little bit of maybe ADHD, certainly not enough to prepare you for a classroom. And when you go out into an education support centre, you've got such a wide variety of disabilities that I was not prepared for through 4 years of university. Well, lots of the teachers that we get coming in as graduates or as experienced teachers as well haven't had any. They might have done one unit at uni on diverse learners, and that ticks the box and you can go in. We get people who have never taught students with disabilities and they're learning it on the job, which often is the case with these kind of jobs. You learn as you go, but it would be really great, and I get this feedback from graduate teachers saying, I would have loved, why don't we get taught this at uni, how to write an individual education program, how to write a behaviour management program that deals with these different disabilities, these different behaviours. And I think lots of the people who teach this kind of subject in universities, in my experience, either haven't taught in a school at all, they went straight from uni to become an academic, or they haven't taught in a classroom for 20 or plus years. So a lot of the stuff we were taught in the lecture theatres, in tutorials, when we got out into a modern day classroom just didn't fly. And so I think there's a real shortage when it comes to skills going into education support. And I'll say that education support centres, schools within mainstream high schools, so you have a centre or a unit with a certain number of kids, it can be quite big, about 100 kids, and they have their own classrooms, but those kids go to workshop or they go to cooking, or some might even be supported with a staff member into maths or English. But then you also have the special education schools, which is a complete setting only for students with profound or complex disabilities. They're a bit different, and so when I talk about ed support, I'm talking about the centres.
Wow. And moving on, what are the other key themes which came out of the Royal Commission you felt you need to be more aware of, you had some views on beyond the education side of it?
So I just wrote a couple of notes
That's
because I knew
fine.
that I would go blank when I was here. I really liked in the Royal Commission. I really liked how there was the emphasis on the whole of society needs changing to deliver the recommendations. So often in the disability world, it's the onus is put on the person with a disability and not looking at the wider society and how we're supporting those people. So I really liked how that was a theme throughout. And I think a really important thing that I really got excited reading was the recommendation for 4.1, which was an establishment of a Disability Rights Act. And I thought, that would be fantastic. And that got me a little bit excited. Yeah.
That's good. Those were high points. And coming on to NDIS review, and before we go there, there's a commonality of language across the Royal Commission and the NDIS review. The use of a language that vision is to deliver inclusive and fair Australia. That's the broader vision we are working for, and which just leads into the NDIS review as well. Within the NDIS review, there are multi-tiered supports. There are 3-tiered supports they talk about. One is the mainstream supports, which is the Department of Education, Transport, Health, Housing. And then you have the second tier is the foundation supports, which is the complementary or supplementary funding provided through different state and territory governments. And the third layer which is individualized funding, which is the NDIS support individual gets. How do you feel what do you feel about the foundation support, which is the linkage between the mainstream and the NDIS supports, and how does it will play in the coming future?
Yeah, so I thought with the connected system, the mainstream, the community supports at the very bottom of the pyramid. Yeah, I think we need to be making sure that those not only diversified but they need to be accessible for the wider community to know what's available out there. We can't. I know Bill Shorten always says, can't be the lifeboat in the ocean, the NDIS, the individualised supports. So those bottom of the pyramid, foundational supports and community supports, I know from a DeafBlind perspective, there are services available, but it's knowing that they're there. So whether that's with your local council, whether that is with a disability service provider, it's getting the message out that these supports are in place. There might be that a community event will have an Auslan interpreter, but it doesn't get publicised, it doesn't get put out there, so people don't go because they think it's not going to be accessible. So I think we do have a bit in place already. It's just I don't think the communication is there.
And I would assume so. All disability events should have Auslan as a default. It should, yes, you're right. It should be stated as part of these events, but I think it should be a default setting in all events. You should have Auslan interpreters, as you do have ramps, as you do have other things. So it should be, and that's probably the assumption of being inclusive and fair in all. Coming to the mainstream supports also. So the assumption here in the NDIS review that the mainstream supports should be inclusive in their current delivery of supports, what they're delivering to their own and within every state and territory government function. So how do you see that, whether a person has to go get a license with the Department of Transport, how does that set of mainstream supports become inclusive?
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Department of Transport. I've spent the last 4 days trying to get seen there at 3 different centres, and I was amazed at. So this is something that everyone has to do, whether or not it's to get a proof of ID or to. I was there to get an NDIS workers clearance check finalised. So. And I've found walking into that I went to 3 different ones. Walking into those buildings, the signage is really poor. It's mainly really muffled auditory, where they say the number. The seating is so cramped because of the numbers that in order to get to your number being called, they only call it twice. So if you're not able to get there in time to that counter, which it's a struggle, they've moved on to the next one. I found I walked in with my ID cane, with my processes on my head very clear, and I had an app on my phone saying what I wanted to say, because sometimes when I tell someone I'm deaf, I don't sound deaf, so people kind of, oh, maybe I misheard. So sometimes I'll put it on my phone as well and show them. And there was no consideration for this person might need a little bit of help when their number is called. They might need assistance getting to the counter. And that's a department, that's a government service that is unavoidable. And I was amazed. So there's a lot of work in those places in a mainstream support setting that are just not there.
Yeah, because and the scheme and broadly the funding supports should work for all Australians who have disabilities, whether they are part of NDIS or not part of NDIS.
Yep.
So hence the assumption is the mainstream supports should be inclusive for all Australians with disability.
And I would say also with Auslan interpreters, it's such a fallacy that all deaf people know Auslan. So sometimes I find it really frustrating when you go to a government, like a council, or you go to checking out the Fringe or the Perth Festival shows, and they have Auslan interpreters, which is great. But I've spoken to people at the Black Swan Theatre Company about this, that not all deaf people know Auslan, and they were shocked. And I said, there's different reasons. Some people grew up with hearing parents who didn't want them to engage with Auslan, and so they just never did, and as an adult they haven't pursued it. Others have tried and it's hard, like it's a whole other language. It's not just key signs. And then there are people like myself who go deaf later in life in a really sudden way. I've been learning Auslan for 5 years. I can't sit there and watch an interpreter translate the whole time. I'll miss half of it. So we need to make sure that when we're thinking about, is this accessible, it's not just an Auslan interpreter. Is there closed captioning? Is there
hearing loop?
Yeah, and if there is captioning, is it in an accessible font and an accessible size for people with vision issues?
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's very enlightening, and I'm sure that it's enlightening for people who are listening and watching both. Moving on to the foundation supports, and then specifically, we'll take the example of Department of Education because that's your expertise and foray, and you have seen that happening. So one of the recommendations in the NDIS review talk about kids with developmental challenges and disabilities and who are in the school system. We will deliver foundation supports through the State and Territory Department of Education, and which means that funding will probably that line item of specific, it could be therapy, it could be speech pathology, something like that. But that foundation supports will be delivered through the Department of Education across all state and territories, which will supplement what the schools are doing. So how do you see that playing out in the education system, and how do you see the state governments using that supplement funding to deliver the inclusive vision?
I think it's going to be really hard to get that consistency, which is the key. If you know that your child has a disability, and they go to a school and you have to move to New South Wales for work, will the New South Wales government be rolling it out in the same timeline, in the same manner as the West Australian government? I wouldn't think so. I would also look at, in terms of how it's implemented, it would then also be school by school and the different socioeconomic areas in terms of how it will be implemented. Because I know that for myself, in my own experience, if we have a student in a class with lots of funding, it's obviously for that student, but the rest of the class benefits because there's more staff in that room for that reason. So then more kids get seen it goes from a 1-to-6 ratio to a 1-to-3, and that's great. And as a teacher, it's brilliant, but that's not classroom to classroom or school to school consistent. So yeah, I think that consistency is the biggest issue.
Mm-hmm. And also, because we're talking the education department, I want to go one level further from a mainstream supports point of view, as in any accessible schools. If you talk about the mainstream school, and if you are not in the special eds, so how do you see the accessibility happening within the mainstream structure?
The only experience I see is at the school that I've taught at for a long time, and I do see students with diagnosis in the mainstream setting, so they get autism. I've seen some with long canes, so they have a vision loss there, and they always have an education assistant with them who sits in the classroom with them. They might take notes, they might help them participate in discussions. But it's one-on-one. That person, that support isn't in place to see. There could be another student who has almost the same support needs as this one, but they don't have the diagnosis or they don't have the means to go through that process, so they're left to flounder. And this person, this support worker, isn't allowed to step in and help that student. So I have witnessed that over the years. So that's what my experience of the mainstream setting is with those students. So when we talk about getting rid of segregation, getting rid of a segregated education system, I get filled with fear and dread that that's what's going to end up happening. You're going to get people up the back, kids up the back who aren't engaged, who might just be given an iPad and sit there while the people at the front are learning the content.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Broadly, the unified support ecosystem has to work in tandem. And the promise 11 years ago was, if a young child born in New South Wales grew up and then moved to a different state, Queensland, and the intention was for a nationalized scheme that he or she might receive a similar set of services or similar set of experience. And this new model is a hybrid model. So the NDIS supports is individualized, it is federated, whereas the foundation support is supported through the Commonwealth but delivered through the state and territory governments, departments, and then you have mainstream supports, which are primarily state. So it's in a hybrid model. So how does that promise is delivered to a young boy or a girl moving from one state to other territory or a state? How does that promise deliver? Works now in the current scenario?
I think it would depend on that person's disability. If it's something maybe a little more understood across broader society, so something, not that it's easy, but say if it was autism. You could go anywhere in Australia and someone would know what that means. They probably know someone who has a diagnosis. But if you are someone who is, say, deaf-blind, there's a very small parts of Australia that are set up to support at that bottom level, the mainstream community services. So you can, Western Australia, especially sort of the Perth Metro, Southwest, that's quite well set up. Victoria is doing really well in terms of deafblindness, but if you were someone who was deafblind in Perth and you moved to a school in Queensland, there's not much there for at that level. If you're an NDIS and you're getting all those specialised supports, you'll probably find someone through that. But if we're trying to have that hybrid model, there are big gaps within the states, depending on which disability you've been diagnosed with.
And there's a 5-year roadmap to implement all of these things. But there is the underlying assumptions of the mainstream has to be inclusive and fair, and so does, the other segments of the community, and then broader Australia has to be more welcoming and inclusive, beyond. And that's which means there is a lot of expenditure to be done or towards the infrastructure, so that the liberty of movement for a person from WA to Queensland, what you were suggesting, should be, they have the liberties to move from one state to other state. It should not be limiting. But until and unless you're suggesting that if there is no parity between the infrastructure and the kind of supports across different states, we will have that people just sticking with only one state where they're comfortable in terms of what supports and services they have.
Yeah, and the thing that I find most interesting, say with deafblindness, is as our community is ageing, we're getting more and more people who maybe not identify as deafblind, but they are. They through the aging process, they've got low vision and they require assistance with hearing. So this population is only getting bigger, no matter where you are in the country. Yet the support systems at that mainstream level don't reflect that, and I think it's going to be. It's just going to be quite an isolating experience if you're going into aged care. And I know this last year I was chatting to someone who works at an outreach centre in Perth to do with seniors, and it was like a drop-in centre during the day for seniors to come in and have that sense of community. And I asked them, do you have, what access do you have in terms of the information they're given? Are you taking into account people with a hearing loss or alternative formats, large print? And they said, no, we really don't have anything set up in place. And she said, it is scary because we're getting more and more people like that, but we're struggling to support them. Yeah.
And the NDIS review does talk about people who are aging, going beyond the time of 65 years. There has to be a transition plan in place for them. But I think there has to be a conversation, people who are beyond 65 plus, and they have disabilities, and how does that function? How does the foundation supports or mainstream support function? Because does the aged care funding include only functional? What does that play out? Lovely. Thank you for sharing those. Going further on the 5-year roadmap, and engaging with the disability community, engaging with we've been heard a lot of terms like co-design, working with the community, and there are many reference groups, and there are 2 committees being set up by Minister Shorten. How do you think in different segments of, as you said, the deaf and blind community, has a different set of challenges? How does co-design work with? How does, if the state government and the Commonwealth government has to work closely with the deaf and blind community on the new initiatives and then create those reference groups or, get that understanding and feedback? What are the best ways to engage, and then what the path forward looks like?
Yeah. Good question. So the deaf-blind community, it is the best way to be able to communicate is a face-to-face initially. So we had people coming and doing outreach to do with the Royal Commission when it was coming up, to get submissions. We also had people explaining the results of the NDIS review Royal Commission. So with the deaf-blind community, the best way to receive information is face-to-face, because there's so much that goes into reading body language. There's tone. There's we have tactile interpreters, so they sit and do the Auslan on the hands. It allows for processing time, and then people to be able to ask questions. That's the biggest thing, is when we put out these reports, what's the avenue for questions or for clarifications? The people in my community sometimes struggle to get out the door. So we have a drop-in centre in Perth every 2 weeks, and that is really the go-to for a lot of our community. They come in, they might have an issue with their local council. They might have an issue with their NDIS, and they sit in a room with other people and gather information together. They learn from each other. So this 5-year plan, and I think it's going to be successful as long as we keep doing these sort of grassroots town hall meetings like we had on Monday in Perth, which was fantastic, which really encourages people to ask questions. No question is a silly question, and you're probably thinking the same thing as the person next to you.
Lovely. My concluding question to you is, in our, we've been talking on a journey for the last 11 years, and then before that, a lot of advocacy has been done to bring parity and then bring, dignified services for people with disabilities in this country. There's a lot of campaigning done before that. In the last 11 years, and then now from here to next 5 years of the, of the roadmap, and it's a long journey. And my concluding question to you is, from a local lingo of Australia, which is, are we there yet on this journey? So the question is, are we there yet on this journey to inclusive and a fairer Australia?
I think we're getting closer. I don't think we're there yet, which is a great question. I think we all have a duty upon ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of the people before us. So the work that I do today is only possible from the people who have been advocating previously before me, and I know that I'll be handing it over at some stage in my life to the next generation. But I think I like to live in hope, and I like to think that we will get there. And the NDIS itself is such an incredible program, such an incredible initiative. I think Australia leads the way, and I'm so lucky to be a participant of this. But I don't think we're there just yet.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your feedback and insights. Thank you.
Thank you.